We're here at Westville in a typical middle-class house, the Grimes-Fagan house, and behind me is a layout of what would be very typical gardens of antebellum period for a middle-class family. The English-style garden was grassy with trees or flowers bordering a grassy parterre, but this was from the continental style. There was a book published around 1712 by Desailly d'Argenville called The Theory and Practice of Gardening that was later translated by John James of Greenwich. And that idea was replicated many times up through the middle 19th century. Basically, it was symmetrically designed raised beds with geometric patterns, frequently with boxwood borders, and inside displays of flowers separated by sanded paths. There weren't many varieties of grass in the South before the Civil War, and people liked shade around their houses, which made it difficult to grow grass. Plus, there weren't really good mowing machines, so the sanded path was the style of the time. As you can see, it gives plenty of opportunities for weeds to grow. And one of our friends down here said, whatever you do that's good for flowers is even better for weeds. These gardens, the content was designed by a young woman from Crawford, Georgia, named Catherine Drury, who specializes in period gardens. So before we go into the gardens themselves, let's take a look at her blueprints. Catherine Drury redesigned these gardens for us in these beautiful watercolored blueprints, which are actually the color schemes of the plants as they bloom. You can see from this overview that the gardens are geometric and symmetrical. And if you are a gardener, you'll recognize a lot of old friends if I just pick out a few going down the list here. Oxide Daisies, Coreopsis, Sweet William, Blanket Flower. This is called Stokes Aster, which puts out a nice blue cluster, and it blooms for several weeks. This is Coreopsis grandiflora. One of my favorites, though it's not blooming yet, is a little plant called plumbago. It's in the leadwort family, and it will put out a bush about this tall. It'll be loaded with blue flowers that bloom for almost 3 months. Put off a real sticky little seed pod that likes to go home with you on your socks. And above this little stand of plumbago, we have a little stand of Oxide Daisy. They've almost peaked now, and I need to cut those back to give them a second shot. And then right next to them will be blooming this summer is common purple phlox. We've started a small antique rose garden here at Westville. You know, the rose revolution really burst forth around from between 1799 and 1867 through the influence of Empress Josephine. She bought 650 acres outside of Paris called Malmaison, dedicated to just rose gardens. 2 China stud roses had been imported into Europe. She was so ambitious about this project that in 1809, during the Napoleonic War, she got diplomatic immunity for a ship to bring over a Hume's pink blush from China. The drive was to take the ancient roses, which only bloomed once, breed them with the Chinese stud roses so you could have a reblooming rose. Now this one is 1752. It's called Old Blush, and it was one of the original stud roses that came in from China that was recrossed. It was actually a hybrid and recrossed with another stud to produce one of the first multi-blooming roses. Here's another type, the tea rose that came out of the recrossings. This one's called Duchess of Brabant. It's about 1837, and it was a favorite boutonniere rose for Teddy Roosevelt. This is a little rose called a noisette from 1848. It's named Jeanne d'Arc, and it was gotten by the cross of the Old Blush with a musk rose, which is highly fragrant. And she'll grow up to be 6 to 8 feet, which will train on a cedar post. Maybe that's the reason they call it Jeanne d'Arc. This is an interesting little China rose. It was brought back from France by the Vice President of Texas named Lorenzo de Zavala. He was a Mexican who sided with the Texans in their bid for independence and brought this little rose back to Louis Philippe in 1834. Not in bloom yet, but this is Sweet William. It was planted by Henry VIII at Hampton Court in 1533, and later by Thomas Jefferson at Shadwell around 1767. This is a pretty common daylily. We're not quite sure of the origin. It was native to China, Japan, and France. No, it was painted by Redoutey at the end of the 18th century, But this orange one is probably the grandparent of all the hybridized daylilies, and folks around here call it a ditch lily. This is commonly called the dayflower. It's in the Spiderwort family and was brought back to England from Virginia. These petals only last a day, and when they drop off underneath, there's a little sticky substance that in folk myth is called widow's tears. This is a moss rose. It gets its name from these little hairy projections on the outside of the bud pod. The plant that's waving in the breeze before me right here is called guara. This is called false blue indigo. True indigo we tried to make that a cash crop before the Revolution. After the Revolution, the British moved the indigo plantations to India. It gives us our dye, which is still very famous in blue jeans. Here below it is what's called bouncing bet. In the colonial times, it was used for soap. If you put a lot of water with it and crush the leaves and rub it for about a minute, you get a lovely Chartreuse lather that was used for hand cleaning. One of my favorite little plants is called rose campion. Puts out a long stem with this sort of pinkish maroon flower on the top, and it loves terrible conditions. It'll throw seeds over into hard clay soil and just propagate itself wonderfully.